On March 5, 1943, Major General Lloyd Fredendall met with Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower at 2nd Corps headquarters in Tunisia. Eisenhower had flown in personally to deliver news that would abruptly end Fredendall's combat career. He was relieved of command effective immediately. His replacement, Major General George S. Patton, Jr., would assume command the following day. Fredendall was ordered to return to Algiers and then to Washington. The order was delivered verbally, with cold professionalism. Eisenhower offered no explanation, none was necessary. 2 weeks earlier, Fredendall's corps had been shattered at Kasserine Pass in the worst American defeat of the North African campaign, thousands of casualties, entire units routed in panic. Fredendall had spent the intervening days blaming everyone but himself. His subordinate commanders were incompetent, the intelligence was insufficient, the troops were inexperienced and panicked under fire. Eisenhower's decision made clear what he thought of those excuses. Fredendall packed his belongings, believing his career was over. He had no idea what awaited him. On February 14, 1943, German Field Marshal Owen Rommel had attacked through Kasserine Pass in central Tunisia. The objective was straightforward: smash through American lines, seize supply depots, and demonstrate that American forces could not withstand seasoned German veterans. Fredendall's 2nd Corps was tasked with defending a 70-mile front with only 30,000 men scattered across small groups. Commanders received conflicting orders, and the defensive line contained gaps large enough for entire panzer divisions to drive through. When Rommel struck, American positions collapsed within hours. Entire battalions broke and fled, equipment was abandoned. Soldiers ran on foot and in vehicles in total chaos. By February 22, German forces had advanced 50 miles. American casualties exceeded 6,000 killed, wounded, or captured, with hundreds of tanks and vehicles destroyed or left behind. It was one of the worst American defeats of World War II, and Fredendall had been nowhere near the fighting. He had built his command post in a canyon far behind the front lines, reportedly 80 to 100 miles from forward positions, and had a company of engineers laboring for more than 3 weeks to blast it out of solid rock, while frontline troops dug shallow foxholes with no overhead cover. While the engineers detonated explosives to clear Fredendall's view in Speedy Valley, 30 miles away his men were hearing a far different kind of explosion: German 88s tearing through thin American armor. One man was building a fortress for himself while his soldiers dug their own graves in the frozen Tunisian mud. He rarely visited forward units, issuing orders by telephone to commanders he had never met. When Eisenhower inspected the front on February 20, the devastation convinced him that Fredendall had to be removed immediately before further damage occurred. George Patton arrived in Tunisia on March 6, 1943. He had been commanding in Morocco when Eisenhower summoned him with urgent orders: take command of 2nd Corps. Fix it. Do it fast. Patton appeared in polished boots, ivory-handled pistols, and an expression of barely controlled fury. He toured every unit within the Corps, firing officers on the spot, enforcing uniform regulations long ignored, and visiting frontline positions Fredendall had never approached. Within 2 weeks, 2nd Corps had transformed. Discipline replaced chaos, aggressive patrolling replaced defensive hesitation. The same soldiers who had fled at Kasserine now stopped German attacks and began winning engagements. The contrast could not have been more stark: same units, same equipment, completely different results. Patton recorded in his diary that Fredendall's command arrangements were the worst he had encountered in his career: the elaborate underground headquarters, the scattered units, and the total absence of forward command presence amounted to professional malpractice. But Patton also noticed something else. Fredendall had already left Tunisia. He was on a plane to Ailers, then Washington, and nobody was talking about what would happen to him. Lloyd Fredendall's flight from Tunisia to Washington took 3 days with stops in Ailers in Morocco. He traveled alone. Except for his aide. No ceremonies, no press, just a quiet removal from theater. The plane landed at Bowling Field outside Washington on March 16, 1943. Fredendall expected to be met by War Department officials, possibly military police. He expected investigations, hearings, possibly a court-martial. What he got instead shocked him. A military band was playing. Reporters were waiting with cameras. A War Department car was ready to drive him to a welcome ceremony. Fredendall stepped off the plane, expecting the cold steel of a court-martial. Instead, he was hit by the brassy, upbeat notes of a military band. It was a sound that didn't belong to a man who had just presided over a Massacre. To anyone who knew the truth, that music must have sounded like a funeral dirge. For military accountability, the official story released to the press was carefully worded. Major General Fredendall had returned from North Africa after distinguished service in combat. He would be assuming new duties commensurate with his experience in rank. There was no mention of being fired, no reference to Cassine Pass, no explanation of why a corps commander had left his command in the middle of a campaign. George Marshall had built the U.S. Army from 200,000 men in 1939 to millions by 1943. He had selected commanders, designed training programs, and created the mobilization system. His reputation was built on competence and accountability. Within days of Fredendall's return, the narrative being pushed in Washington was extraordinary. Fredendall was a combat veteran with valuable experience. His insights would be invaluable for training armies still being mobilized. Reporters who tried to ask about Cassine Pass were deflected. Operational details couldn't be discussed for security reasons. Fredendall's failure at Kasserine was Marshall's failure. Now, Marshall faced an impossible choice. He could court-martial Fredendall and admit publicly that his judgment had been catastrophically wrong, or he could quietly shove Fredendall somewhere he couldn't do more damage. Marshall chose the second option, but there was a complication. Fredendall had powerful friends in Congress. Representatives and senators from his home state were already asking questions about why he had been brought home. They wanted assurances his service was being properly recognized. Marshall faced an awkward situation. Eisenhower had recommended Fredendall for promotion to lieutenant general back in November 1942. Before Cassine Pass, the recommendation was sitting in the War Department, awaiting approval. Now Marshall had to decide whether to proceed with a promotion for a general who had just been fired for incompetence. Marshall decided to proceed. Fredendall would be promoted to lieutenant general and assigned to command 2nd Army, a training organization in the United States. The promotion would move forward as if Cassim had never happened. When Eisenhower heard about he was stunned. He had just fired Fredendall for incompetence. Now Marshall was promoting him. On June 1, 1943, Lloyd Fredendall was promoted to lieutenant general. The ceremony took place at the War Department with full military honors. Marshall himself pinned on the 3rd star. The official citation praised Fredendall's leadership in North Africa, his combat experience, and his contributions to developing American tactical doctrine against German forces. It made no mention of Cassine Pass. It contained no hint that he had been relieved of command in disgrace less than 5 weeks earlier. Fredendall was now the same rank as George Patton, who had salvaged the situation in Tunisia. The man who caused the disaster wore the same 3 stars as the man who fixed it. The promotion announcement reached Tunisia within days. Officers who had served under Fredendall's failed command read the news in stars and stripes with disbelief and fury. Imagine being a sergeant in the 1st Armored, sitting in the dust of a defeated camp, holding a greasy copy of Stars and Stripes. You see the face of the man who sent your friends to die from a hole in the ground, and above his head is a new star. That wasn't just a promotion, it was a middle finger to every man who had actually bled in the pass. But the bitterest reaction came from Patton himself. He had just finished court-martialing officers for failures at Kasserine. He had relieved commanders for not being aggressive enough for not visiting. Frontline positions for command. Arrangements that scattered forces. Fredendall had done all of these things on a massive scale. And his reward was a third star. While the third star was being pinned in Washington, letters started reaching the War Department from the dust of Tunisia. Fredendall had been assigned to command Second Army, a training organization in Memphis, Tennessee. He would never see combat again. The anger in those letters was raw. How could the general responsible for the worst American defeat of the war be promoted while subordinates were court-martialed? Why were the men who followed his orders being destroyed while he wore 3 stars in Memphis? Marshall's response was always the same. General Fredendall's record speaks for itself. His current assignment makes the best use of his experience and abilities. Personnel decisions are based on the needs of the service. What Marshall couldn't say publicly was the truth. Fredendall's congressional connections made firing him politically dangerous. His powerful friends in Wyoming had made clear that any public disgrace would trigger investigations and hearings. Marshall had shielded the institution. The decision established a precedent that would haunt the Army for the rest of the war. Political connections could protect incompetent generals from the consequences of their failures. The contrast with other Cassine commanders made Fredendall's promotion even more grotesque. Major General Orlando Ward commanded the 1st Armored Division under Fredendall at Kasserine. Ward had protested Fredendall's orders to scatter his division across 70 miles. He had warned that the dispositions were indefensible. Fredendall overruled him. When the German attack came, Ward's scattered units were defeated in detail, exactly as he had predicted. Ward fought desperately to contain the breakthrough, moving constantly between units, trying to organize a coherent defense. After Kasserine, Patton relieved Ward in early April 1943 during the follow-up Battle of Elgater. Patton felt Ward had become too cautious, traumatized by the disaster Fredendall's orders had created. Ward was reassigned to administrative duties as Chief of Field Artillery, though he later returned to combat with the 20th Armored Division in 1945 and had a distinguished post-war career. The relief effectively ended his wartime command trajectory at the moment when Fredendall was being promoted. The purge of Kasserine-era officers continued even after the Army started winning under Patton. Regimental commanders who had followed Fredendall's orders were court-martialed for the failures those orders caused. Battalion commanders were relieved for not holding positions that Fredendall had made impossible to defend. These officers had no congressional protection. They had no political connections powerful enough to save them. They paid the price while Fredendall was promoted. Patton watched this unfold with disgust. He was a man who believed in a mystical ancient code of the warrior. To him, Fredendall wasn't just a bad general, he was a sin against the profession of arms. Every time Patton had to salute a man like Fredendall or see him wearing the same 3 stars, it was a reminder that even in the middle of a world-ending war, the Old Boys Club was the one thing that remained bulletproof. He told his staff that the Army was punishing the wrong people. The Corps commander who caused the disaster was safe in Tennessee wearing 3 stars. The division and regimental commanders who tried to salvage his mistakes were being destroyed. It was a lesson about military politics that Patton never forgot. Competence mattered less than connections. Taking responsibility was career suicide. Blame could be deflected downward as long as you had friends in Washington. Dwight Eisenhower watched Fred and Dahl's promotion from North Africa with carefully maintained public silence. He had recommended Fredendall's relief. He had sent Patton to fix the disaster. He knew exactly how badly Fredendall had failed, but Eisenhower didn't just stay silent. He actively participated in the cover-up. He wrote to Marshall supporting the idea of giving Fredendall a hero's welcome. His reasoning was brutally political. If the American public learned a corps commander had been fired for incompetence, it would destroy national morale. Better to hide the failure than risk public confidence in the army. Eisenhower never protested the promotion. He didn't write dissenting memos. He made his views known only to his immediate staff. Years later, Eisenhower's chief of staff explained why Eisenhower was supreme Allied commander in a theater where American, British, and French forces had to work together. He couldn't afford a political war with the War Department over personnel decisions. If he challenged Marshall's handling of Fred and Dahl, he would create enemies in Washington who could undermine his authority in theater. So Eisenhower made a cold calculation. He would work within that system rather than fight it. This decision would shape his command style for the rest of the war. When other generals failed, Eisenhower would relieve them quietly, reassign them to non-combat positions, and let the War Department handle the public relations. He would never again try to hold failed commanders publicly accountable. The lesson was clear: military competence mattered less than political survival. And Eisenhower chose to survive. The real explanation for Fred and Dahl's promotion wasn't military merit, it was congressional politics, and the smoking gun was hidden in a family tree most people had never examined. Fredendall's family had deep connections to Wyoming political machinery. His father had been a protege of Senator Francis E. Warren of Wyoming. Warren was the father-in-law of General John J. Pershing. This family tree of military and political power made Fredendall untouchable. Marshall himself was General Pershing's former aide and protege. He could not easily move against a man whose family was so closely tied to Pershing's own father-in-law. When word reached Washington that Fredendall might be court-martialed or publicly disgraced, those relationships activated. Phone calls were made to the War Department. Meetings were requested with Marshall. Questions were asked in congressional committees about whether General Fredendall was being made a scapegoat for institutional failures in training and doctrine. Marshall understood the threat. Congressional investigations into North African command decisions could expose problems across the entire mobilization system. The disaster at Cassine had many fathers. Making Fred and Dahl the sole scapegoat could trigger examinations that would embarrass everyone. Better to quietly promote him, assign him where he couldn't do damage, and move on. The public would never know the details. The Army would maintain its image of competence, and congressional friends would be satisfied their man was being treated fairly. It was cynical political calculation masquerading as personnel management, and it worked perfectly. Fredendall kept his stars, his pension, and his reputation. The Army avoided congressional investigations. Marshall avoided admitting his judgment had been wrong. Everyone won except the soldiers who had died at Cassine and the competent officers whose careers were destroyed. Fredendall spent the remainder of the war at Second Army in Memphis, training infantry divisions. By all reports, he performed adequately in the role, which required administrative skill rather than battlefield judgment. No scandals emerged from his headquarters, yet everyone who served under him knew his true record. His third star was earned not through achievement, but through political protection, and the cynicism this fostered spread throughout the officer corps. Men who had survived Rommel's attacks in North Africa found themselves sitting in Memphis classrooms while Fredendall lectured on modern tactics. The absurdity was obvious to all. Some officers later credited him with teaching valuable lessons about what not to do in combat. His failures at Kassim became case studies in poorly organized defensive positions, remote command, and scattered forces. In a twisted sense, Fredendall's greatest contribution to the war effort was serving as a cautionary example of catastrophic leadership. Officers studied his mistakes and resolved never to repeat them. The war ended in May 1945. Fredendall remained at 2nd Army until June 1946 and then retired at the rank of lieutenant general with full honors. His official biography described him as a distinguished combat veteran who had served his country with honor, while the Kassim disaster was mentioned only briefly in histories that focused on Rommel's tactical skill and the inexperience of American troops. His name appeared in footnotes rather than chapters. He lived quietly in California until his death in 1963 at the age of 79. He never wrote memoirs, gave interviews about Kassim, or publicly addressed his relief or the promotion controversy. Omar Bradley's 1951 memoir, A Soldier's Story, included one devastating paragraph, noting that Fredendall had lived in a command post blasted from solid rock 80 miles behind the lines while his troops were exposed in foxholes, that he commanded by telephone rather than presence, and that his relief was completely justified. Patton's wartime diaries, published posthumously, were more blunt. While Bradley estimated the bunker was 80 miles back, Patton, never one for understatement, recorded it as a full 100 miles from the men doing the dying. He called Fredendall a coward who sent soldiers to die while building himself that bunker and described the promotion as a disgrace to the service, though his official reports had been restrained to maintain military decorum. Eisenhower's memoirs were more diplomatic but equally damning, noting that Fredendall's relief was necessary for the good of the service and one of the clearest decisions of the war. Yet none of these accounts altered the fact that Fredendall retired as a 3-star general with a comfortable pension while more capable officers were destroyed for lesser failures. In the late 1950s, General Marshall was interviewed by his official biographer, Forrest Pogue, about wartime decisions. When asked about Fredendall's promotion, Marshall defended it on institutional grounds. Publicly destroying Fredendall would have required court-martial proceedings that exposed the unpreparedness of American forces in early 1943. Troops were inexperienced, doctrine untested, and training inadequate against German veterans. Even Rommel had noted this. Promoting Fredendall to a training role removed him from combat while preserving the Army's reputation. Marshall never expressed regret, but his defensive tone suggested he understood the cost. The consequences of this compromise rippled through the remainder of the war, establishing a system where failure could be survived through political protection while ambitious officers learned that cultivating connections mattered as much as tactical skill. It became a system where failure led to promotion while success was optional, where political influence outweighed battlefield results, where the institution shielded the guilty and punished the capable. Soldiers paid the price. Over 6,000 Americans were casualties at Kassim Pass due to Fredendall's incompetence. After the war, the families of these men learned that the general responsible had been promoted while their sons were interred in North Africa. Political face-saving is often discussed as a victimless crime, but each star on Fredendall's shoulder was paid for in agonizing installments by families across Wyoming, Illinois, and New York, who received telegrams offering flags and hollow thanks instead of promotions. In Washington, a career was saved. In North Africa, a cemetery was filled. The man accountable for the disaster at Kassim Pass retired with full honors, a 3-star pension, and a reputation protected by the most powerful men in the Army. History is written by the winners, but sometimes it is also edited by those too embarrassed to admit they chose the wrong man. In war, competence may be negotiable, but connections endure forever.